Anyway, Benjamin, I read your book on audio, so I got to hear you cursing and using all these words. And so, by the way, trigger warning, since that's a big thing these days, we're going to use all of the words, all of the nasty words, including George Carlin's shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits, and a bunch of others that are, well, to show you how far we've come, I mean, Lenny Bruce had ass and balls as his 9 words you can't say. Those sound so tame now.
Yeah, those go through on broadcast television now.
Yeah. So, but before we get into the details of the book, how did you come to be interested in profanity and curse words and all that? You're a cognitive scientist at UC San Diego. You study language and cognition. What's the connection to profanity?
Yeah, well, I've always been fascinated about how we're able to transmit ideas through time and space by flapping our lips or by twiddling our thumbs. And historically, I've been interested in kind of the rational side of things. You know, I'm a philosopher, and so I see a cat on a mat, and I want to tell you about that. How do I do that? How do our brains do that? But as I started to turn towards the more emotional side of language, like how do we convey strong emotions that we're experiencing in a moment, the obvious first place to start was those words that we use to express the strongest emotions and that elicit the strongest emotions in other people. And so I started to dig a little bit into the science surrounding that, what's happening in our brains that causes us to swear or that happens as a response to hearing other people swear, what makes words profane in a society over time, what's profane across cultures and languages, how do we use our hands to do some of the same work, and why. And that brought me to discover that there actually is a little small science of swearing. It's largely been done undercover, and that's because people want to get tenure at their universities and feel like maybe this might not be the best way to do it. It's also true that we have taboos about these words. By definition, they're taboo words, and so there are taboos about using them in public places, and so you don't really see a lot of media, or you didn't, at least until relatively recently, see a lot of media actually printing these words. The New York Times just cleared another benchmark this last week and published another new word that they had never published before. It's a word that starts with P and has 5 letters that they had never published before in that particular way. And so media is changing, and so I thought this was a really opportune time to kind of open a public discussion about this open secret that we all have, which is that there are these words that we all know that sometimes slip out, and sort of explore the science of it.
Well, let's start with defining profanity. I mean, is this like pornography? I know it when I hear it, but it's hard to define specifically. And when, before I read your book, I thought, well, the FCC has this list of words, and they must have this crack team of researchers that have all this data. Yeah. And it turns out that none of this is true, right?
Right. I mean, the idea that there would be a government organ that would have a crack team of researchers is kind of a laughable one, right?
Right.
To begin with. But that notwithstanding, no, there's no list. There's no list. And the FCC censors, but they don't have a list that they offer to the television and radio broadcasters. The MPAA, just down the street here, which governs, they're the ones who put the letters on all the movies. Motion Picture Academy of America, right there. They, they decide what's PG-13 and what's R. They don't have a list that they offer to the studios. It is very much are we offended? Where we is actually not even known because the members of the MPAA board are not actually published. They're anonymous parents.
Right.
So we don't really know. Now there has been a little bit of science on this. People have, not them, but researchers have gone out and asked people, like, this word, how offensive is it from 1 to 7? How taboo is it from 1 to 7? How likely would you be to use it from 1 to 7? And when you do this rigorously across cultures and across languages, you get relatively consistent answers for a group of people at a particular time in a particular place that people can roughly tell you what the strongest words of their language are. And in the book, I saw that you were opening to that page. We've got some charts of.
So you have America, England, and New Zealand in here. Right. Mm-hmm. So for us, nigger, cunt, fag, cocksucker, chink, motherfucker, buttfuck, bitch, retard, dyke, and whore are the top 10.
And notice which word isn't in there. It's a 4-letter word that starts with F. That doesn't show up until 15, I think.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yes, it's way down here. Okay.
Right. So there's this really interesting fact, which you wouldn't know if you watched if you counted what words were bleeped on television, which is that for contemporary young Americans, so these are millennials here who were surveyed, the strongest words in the language are actually mostly slurs. They're words that are derogatory terms for people based on, and the ones that you listed, based on ethnicity, race, religion, sex, sexual orientation. Those are the words that young people find most offensive. It's not actually, for the most part, Carlin's words.
Right.
Those words that, that just are profane because of tradition, not because they're used to harm someone, those don't really offend younger people as much as they did, our generation.
So had you done that survey in the 50s, it would have been a radically different
It would have
list.
been very different, right? And many older people report this kind of confusion that there are words like retard that show up on the list of most offensive words for young people. Like retard, isn't that just a thing that kids use on the playground? Like that's not that's not worse than fuck, right?
Right.
But according to young adults, it is.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, our attitudes have changed, and in a way, it makes sense, right? Why would these arbitrary four-letter words, why would they be bad? Why would we be banned from saying this particular word that describes defecation, for example, when there are a whole bunch of other words for defecation that describe the exact same object or activity or whatever you want to call it, that are perfectly acceptable because you would use them, like defecation, you would use them with your doctor, you would use them with your priest. There are ones that you would use with your kids because you have to talk about that activity when you're training them to use the potty. Why would this particular word be called out as bad? And so there's this arbitrariness is kind of showing itself with the democratization of language that we see now with, social media and that sort of thing.
Right. I was amazed to see in England, wanker is ranked higher than nigger.
Yeah.
Wanker. I mean, that's one of my favorite words to call somebody. It's a wanker. But there, that would really be bad, I guess.
Really?
So there's cultural differences.
There are absolutely cultural differences. England and the U.S. being, divided by a common tongue. There's
Right.
there are huge differences. I mean, also on that list you'll see Paki. I don't really know how you pronounce it. P-A-K-I, which is a derogatory slur for people from South Asia, so Indian and Pakistani people. And what you notice, of course, is that the words that we find the most offensive are ones that, at least nowadays, are ones that target particular people who have a lack of power, right? So it's, notice that honky wasn't on that list.
Oh, right.
Or whitey wasn't on that list. And the
Right.
reason, even though they do very similar work, right? They're used to insult people. Nevertheless, it's not people who have been marginalized, dehumanized. And so it's a combination of the word being used to harm and also a history and possibility of harm that seems to really catch people's attention.
Remember the SNL bit with Chevy Chase and Richard Pryor, where they're doing word exchange.
Right.
And he worked his way, Chevy Chase worked his way up to nigger. The previous slur elicited, honky, and then nigger, dead honky.
Right.
So it is a power counter in a light, fun way, but touching a deep subject there. So I found it useful that you had four categories: religious, sex, bodily waste, and slurs. So nigger, obviously, slur. Religious would be like Jesus fucking Christ. I mean, that just seems so light here, but other countries that's much worse, I guess.
Yeah.
What would be some other religious-oriented?
Well,
profanity?
hell,
hell.
A lot of people find...
Damn, goddamn.
Right, or just the use of the word God. People find, and this is something so we're in California, people have much more liberal views with respect to religious language and blasphemy and that sort of thing. Elsewhere in the country, that's not necessarily true. And certainly throughout the history of English, that hasn't been true. So if you look at the history of the strongest words in English, so we're in, let's say we're in the slur era. This is the century in which slurs are the worst words of the language. The last century was probably not that. It was probably, if you look at the lists that people like Carlin assembled, they were words that surrounded sex, bodily functions. This is probably related to a sort of Victorian turn, a belief throughout the 19th and 20th centuries that sex was not to be discussed. And even until the Kinsey report, right, in the 40s, there just wasn't popular discussion of sexuality in public, right? But before that time, before the 18th century, the strongest words in English were religious terminology. So words that we just don't have anymore, like gadzooks, which comes from God's eyes.
Oh, right.
Or God, or zounds, from God's wounds, which, of course, we don't recognize or use anymore. But these were strong words. And in Shakespeare's time, taking the Lord's name in vain would be a very useful way to get yourself in trouble.
Right.
And well, yeah, like you said, when you look around, the Society of Nations, you find that there are languages and cultures in which the strongest words really are religious terminology. You go north to Quebec, and their strongest words are they're words called sacre, which are holy words. So the strongest words in Quebecois are tabarnak, which is tabernacle, and calice, which is chalice. I mean, these are they're strong. If you break your leg and you need to get out something, it's going to be one of these religious terms.
Wow.
Similarly, in Italian, the bestemmie, where you basically add the word pig onto any religious concept. So porco Dio, porca Madonna, super offensive, worst words in the language. So you get these sort of cultural differences, and of course that's notwithstanding places where using religious language out of context is blasphemy and has legal repercussions, like corporal punishment or capital punishment. So in Pakistan, certain types of blasphemy are punishable by death. Afghanistan, same thing. Malaysia, same thing. So there are, it's not. We're in a way a kind of an exception in the history of nations. That it's not that bad.
Right. And do the slurs, I mean, obviously they must change in their emphasis, but like spick or kike or chink, I mean, these were groups that were much more targeted before than less so now, and maybe they have less emphasis than, say, nigger does as a slur. So that's going to change over time.
These things seem to change. Well, there are two things. There's the specific words, right? Because the specific words used may come in and out of offensiveness. So retard is now very offensive, but wasn't before. That's a change that's different from whether a particular social group has slurs associated with them. And I think that what we see with kike, for example, it's not the case that that Jewish people in America are largely disempowered and feel that they are marginalized. And so I think that in general, Jewish people in America don't take as much offense to that word as, for example, maybe African Americans do to a word like nigger, where very clearly there is a continuing history, an uninterrupted trajectory of disempowerment and dehumanization that continues to this day, and that is something that word hooks into in a continuous way. I mean, I teach at UC San Diego, and we have a very large Asian American population among our undergrads. And when we talk about slurs in my undergraduate classes, I bring up the example of Jeremy Lin, who was a basketball player.
Yes.
He's Asian American. He's from Palo Alto, and when he was the first Asian American NBA player, professional basketball player in the country. And the day that he was playing for the New York Knicks, the day that he first showed that he might not be as amazing as everyone thought that he was, ESPN ran a headline that said, "A chink in the armor." Oh. And, okay, so...
I missed that one.
Probably a mistake.
Yes.
They probably didn't mean it.
Right.
Or probably. But when I show this to my undergrads, many, I wouldn't say the majority of whom are Asian American, but very close to half of whom are Asian American, they look at it and they're like, ooh. And then they sort of, but that's it. I mean, it's not anything more than, oh, that's gauche, right? Like, I can't believe they did that. They don't find this to be the kind of mortal offense that, they should write a letter, or they take personal offense at it. And I think that that's because in that environment at UC San Diego, they're a plurality, if not maybe a plurality, maybe they're a very large minority. They don't feel disempowered in any way. The students in my class are often bio majors. They know they're on their way to great careers as doctors and scientists, and they don't feel like they have anything that the society is holding something against them.
So this would explain, I suppose, why the potentially offended group can use their slurs themselves in jokes and humor and whatever, or in slang, nigga, as you pointed out, different than nigger, particularly within the group, because there's no power differential there.
Yeah.
So the slur doesn't carry the weight that it would if for an outsider.
There are a lot of reasons why people do that, why they reappropriate those slurs. One is, of course, because they can. And the second is to take away its sting. So there is oftentimes a self-conscious idea that this word is being used by outsiders as a kind of leverage against us, right? Because we don't like it, we don't want it to be used. That's known, and so people can use that because they have the right to say words that they want to say. They can use their free speech to hurt us,
right,
to cause us harm. But we can take away a little bit of that leverage by reappropriating it, right? By saying, okay, no, this is so queer. Queer isn't a thing that you call us. Queer is a thing that we call ourselves, right? Yeah, we're queer. We're proud to be queer or gay. You see this with slut walks. I don't know if you've seen these things, but this is a way to kind of reappropriate norms about sexual activity. And you see it in the Montreal LGBTQ community has had for a while, I don't know if they still do, these every monthly festivals that they call Faggoty Ass Friday, right? And they call it that because they don't want that word, which is used to cause harm and which they feel causes harm. They don't want it to be solely the possession of people who are outsiders. They want to take it over and use it in a positive way. So that's another reason why people.
I wonder if there's a difference. You discussed in the book closed versus open endings of words. Mm-hmm. So gay is sort of open and happy. Fag, it has that harsh close to it. Maybe that triggers something in the brain that makes it feel emotionally different.
There's something going on. We know that English speakers, if you ask them, you give them some brand new word, and that word ends with a consonant, especially one of those hard stop consonants, they think that it's more likely to be a profane word, to be an offensive word, than if it ends with an open, like with a vowel, like gay, just keeps going on and on for days. Fag stops in a pointed way.
Right.
And you see this in how English speakers make up new words. So when people make up new taboo words, real ones, they tend to follow this pattern. So my undergraduates introduced me to a word that's a derogatory term for people with Asperger's syndrome, which is spurg, which follows that same pattern with that hard g sound at the end. Other examples you see in fiction. So when people make up new words in Game of Thrones or Star Trek, or those new swear words in these invented languages tend to follow this pattern. There's something about it that seems to sound vulgar, and it's possible that people have been less successful at reappropriating fag just because it still sounds bad.
I'm reminded of about a decade ago, there was a small enclave of atheists who wanted to change what we call ourselves. Instead of atheist, skeptic, humanist, freethinker, whatever, let's call ourselves brights. We're the brights. It's a sort of a happy word like gay. Gay rights, gay pride, gay marches. We're going to have bright pride, bright marches, bright rights. And so Dawkins and Dennett, me and others started using the word and writing op-eds and essays and trying to make it happen from the top down, and it just never caught on. Because I think you can't, by fiat, determine the use of a word. It just either happens or it doesn't. In any case, then, it wasn't long before people pointed out the antonym to bright is dim. You mean the people that believe in God are dim? To which Dawkins goes, well, yeah. So it's like, yeah, but they're not going to really probably want to use that word. Anyway, it never did catch on, and we're just atheists or whatever. So
it's hard to engineer language.
Yeah, I mean, how did 9/11 get started? I mean, how did that gay rights became a thing, and it's like okay now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people are trying to engineer language all the time, right? The catch is making it catch on, and that's harder.
Yeah. Well, it has to have a meme-like characteristic, which meme did.
Right.
Dawkins put that right at the end of the selfish gene as almost a throwaway, and then it became a thing. Mm-hmm. So, but you can't make that happen. Another thing I was reminded of reading your book was the film Fargo, where William Macy plays that sort of geeky Midwesterner who talks in this sort of slangy Midwestern thing. And instead of saying, you're damn right, he says, you're darn tootin'. And I thought, is that a thing in the Midwest? You're darn tootin'? But then I started thinking, you're damn right sounds firmer and more confident. Your darn tootin' sounds, well, it sounds gay. No, I don't know. No, just, sorry. I mean, it just sounds too light, or maybe there's something in the brain that, damn versus darn.
Well, we certainly know that these people oftentimes create these alternates to swears. They're called minced oaths. A minced oath is like darn or shucks or shut the front door or,
Right.
And they kind of serve two functions, right? You're sort of having your cake and eating it too, because they usually start with the same sound. So everyone knows exactly what you mean, but they end with something different, so you have plausible deniability, right?
Right.
And these are oftentimes adopted as just sort of the default way that you express strong emotions in public when you know that the norms are such that you can't use the profanity itself.
I wonder if it's something like another scene in that film where he gets pulled over by the cop and he doesn't want it to go any further, so he pulls out his wallet with his driver's license with 100 slipped up, and he says, "I thought we could just take care of this right here in Brainerd." And I forget what that's called, like common knowledge or something like that.
Common ground.
Okay. Where both people know what they're saying, but
Yeah.
you can't say it.
Right.
Like, this is a bribe. Oh, I'm taking a bribe. Maybe there's certain language that goes like that.
That's right. Yeah, it is sort of like that, right? We believe that everyone knows what we're talking about, and so by using this alternate version, we're sort of hinting at it. It's kind of like a double entendre in a way.
Right. So in the brain itself, I was just with a friend of mine who had a stroke about a decade ago, and he lost all his language. And now when you talk to him, he sounds perfectly normal. How'd you do it? Singing. So the speech therapy was singing. And he says it's a different part of the brain. Like the Beatles, when they sing, they don't sound British. And it's like, oh yeah, why is that? Because it's a different part of the brain that sings. And so in your book, you have this brain picture with the basal ganglia, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, which are classically associated with speech and words. But this basal ganglia, which has you don't think of it as anything to do with speech. So that's more emotions.
Right. Yeah, so fascinatingly, people like your friend who suffer brain damage, it could be from a stroke or it could be from traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's, various different things that cause damage to the main language centers of the brain, right? Those are those famous Broca's and Wernicke's areas, which are usually over here in the left hemisphere of almost all right-handed people and most left-handed people. When people have damage to those parts of their brain, they often also suffer a syndrome known as aphasia. And the version of aphasia that people get when they have damage to Broca's area in particular is that they have trouble producing language, and so that's presumably what your friend had. The really interesting thing that you find, though, is when you look at case studies of people who have damage to those language centers of the brain, is that oftentimes they'll show a behavior that's kind of like this. You'll give them a task. It's a picture of a cat and a dog, and the cat's chasing the dog, and they're supposed to describe the picture, and the cat, and they just can't get the word out. And then they'll say, cat, God damn it. And so the word cat, they can't intentionally get out. They can't rationally conjure up that word. But there's a different system in the brain, obviously, that is still intact, that produces the spontaneous, unintentional, emotional, reflexive profanity. And we've known this for 150 years, since the very beginning, since before Broca and Wernicke themselves in the late 19th century discovered aphasia. Since even before that, we've known that people with aphasia oftentimes preserve the ability to swear. And this is true even if people have their entire left hemisphere removed. So sometimes a person will have a tumor that's so invasive and that's so malignant that the only solution is to remove the entire hemisphere. This is done less and less now, but through the 60s and 70s, it was more common than you would hope, and we know from a number of case studies that people who have only one hemisphere left in their brain, their language centers have been removed along with the rest of their left hemisphere of their brain, they still swear spontaneously, and those are among the only words that they have. And so we know that it's a different system, and as you said, it's the system that seems to be implicated is part of the limbic system, which is responsible for emotion regulation, selecting actions on the basis of the emotions that you're experiencing right now, suppressing actions on the basis of emotions, and in particular the basal ganglia, which seems to be the part that when compromised, people have trouble swearing spontaneously. It's also, interestingly, a part of the brain that's compromised in Tourette syndrome. So when people have trouble regulating actions because of this developmental syndrome, sometimes those actions that they have trouble regulating are words. So you may think of Tourette syndrome as, just like swear words, potty language that comes out, but it's mostly not that. That only happens about 10% of the time. But in all cases, what happens, one main difference between people with Tourette syndrome and people who are neurotypical is the basal ganglia. It appears to be different in volume, different in density. And so we know that the basal ganglia plays an important role in regulating, both activating and suppressing these strongest words in our language that we produce when we're experiencing strong emotions.
So I wonder if it evolved in a different track than language and then written language, almost its own thing for some emotional expressive purposes. I mean, you talk about experiments in which subjects put their hand in a bucket of ice water and you can only last for a minute or two before it's so painful you have to take it out. But if you go, fuck, 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 you can last much longer. For some reason, the cursing suppresses the pain, or I don't know what it does, maybe more endorphins or something.
Right. It's nearly twice as long. You can hold your hand in there nearly twice as long. There are a couple of different accounts. The main account goes back kind of to an idea of Steven Pinker's and probably before that, which is that profanity activates a fight or flight response. So this system of physiological reactions that you produce spontaneously when you recognize a threat. And that includes things like blood rushing to your extremities, and increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, a flow of adrenaline. And one of the things that people can do in this fight or flight state is endure pain more, right? As you would need to do. If you're going to fight, you're going to need to endure pain. If you're going to flee, it's also going to be painful because you're going to be running and that hurts. And so, at least for me, it does. And so, maybe not for the high school kids. So if profanity triggers this system, then it would also have the consequence of minimizing pain. It would have this hypoalgesic effect. That's right. Although the interesting thing is that the studies that, I don't know if I talked about this in the book, further studies on this have tracked who exactly gets the pain benefit from swearing. And it turns out that it's people who swear the least in their regular lives. So people who swear all the time,
well, that makes sense,
show very little hypoalgesic effect from swearing. It's almost as if you become inured to these particular words.
And that makes me wonder if, as these words get used more and more on cable TV, on the internet, podcasts, and so on, it just comes flowing out. It becomes so common, you're not jarred by it anymore, whereas you would be on just, say, normal broadcast TV.
I think that's the difference between us and my undergrads.
Right.
They're digital natives. Most of the language that they consume comes directly from someone else's thumbs, with no censor in between. Right. That wasn't the case when I was their age. So I think that's exactly the consequence is exactly that you become inured to them.
And so, it not only does it not harmful, maybe it's even beneficial in some ways to limit your cursing, directed. Orchestrated cursing at just the right time or something like that.
It seems that way. I mean, so there's the hypoalgesic effect, right? Slam your finger in the door. It may help to swear. It certainly can't hurt. There are other things that people hypothetically have suggested it could be useful for. So catharsis in general. So I'm angry at someone. So I just drove up here from San Diego this morning. There were ample opportunities for me to be angry at other people. I didn't swear, but that's because I was listening to NPR, and that has a calming effect in general. But
yes, those voices.
Right, but
yes.
But right. So some people have hypothesized that you can sort of curse your way out of a tizzy. That you can subsequently alleviate some anger such that you act less aggressively towards a person later, or that you can alleviate stress. So if you have a really stressful situation, so if I were really nervous about talking to you, maybe we in the green room, we won't tell people what actually happened, but maybe back there in the green room I would have let loose a string of epithets and expletives, and maybe that would have helped. But there's no science on either of those, actually. We don't know about those benefits.
And it seems like the context or the way you say it makes a difference. I'm just thinking like when I ride my bike with my buddies and we're doing a hard, long climb, you get to the top, it's like, fuck, fucking hey, man, that was really hard. Versus, fucking hey, Bubba, let's just have a good time here in our conversation. I mean, that sounds different. It feels different.
Yeah. Well, sure. And when you actually look at data tracking how people actually use profanity, you just, imagine just going out into the world in daily life with a notepad, just write down every time you hear profanity. And people have done this. Tim Jay at University of Massachusetts led the longest study. It was a year. There were tens of thousands of profanities that were tracked by the 4 researchers. What they found that was that there were a lot of uses, overwhelmingly positive in various ways. This included use by kids, around kids, by adults, around adults. They were used to be funny, to be casual, right? To cement an interaction as informal, to ostensibly alleviate stress, that sort of thing. Yes, sometimes being aggressive. That's certainly not the only way. So yeah, you see this particularly in workplaces, where people will try to make an interaction more informal, try to be chummy with someone by talking a little bit more casually, and profanity is one of the ways that people do that.
When did it become a moral issue? Like it's wrong, it's bad, don't do it, it's harmful to kids. It's, people are just making stuff up apparently because there were no studies, right?
Right. Well, it's always been a moral issue. I mean, the religious side of things has always been a moral issue, right? That's a dictate. The reason you can't, the reason you can't say the name of the Jewish God, that you have to say the
G dash
the acronyms,
D,
right?
Yeah.
Is because it is believed that is a moral offense,
right?
And so the religious stuff has always been that way. I think that largely this has happened in the last century, that people have started to decide that there must be some harm that's caused to children, and the reasoning seems to be rationalization to me. So think about it, the reason that I think that the word fuck is a bad word is exactly and only because when I was a child, people told me that. I was punished for using it. I saw that adults who were modeling behavior that I would then come to imitate would avoid it in public, avoid it in certain circumstances, even though I know that they use it in private. And so I learned there's something bad about using these words in public, or about using the words in general. And so now I'm an adult, and if I don't really inspect that belief, I have no reason not to believe it's a bad word. And adults have this amazing capacity to rationalize and justify the beliefs that they have that are totally untethered to reality. And so you go grasping for explanations. And one explanation is that it must cause children the reason it's bad, the reason we don't use it around kids, is because it will cause them to be more aggressive, right? If they hear this word, and they start to use this word, it's a gateway form of aggression. Right? They're going to start abusing people because they heard me swear when I stubbed my toe. Another sort of rationalization or justification that people provide is, these words, they must do something harmful cognitively to children, right? Kids who use these words will use them as a crutch, and they won't learn lots of other words, and their vocabularies will be stunted. Right? You've probably heard this.
Yes. Yeah.
This is totally
like it's bumping other words out of the category.
Exactly. Yeah. So they just won't learn their SAT words because they're just saying fuck all the time. And that's complete bunkum. So we know we don't know this from kids per se, but kids eventually become college students where we can study them.
Right.
And we know that kids who become the college students who have the greatest ease with profanity. So if you give them, you say, okay, list as many words of profanity as you can in 15 seconds, go. So the ones who can generate the most profanity in 15 seconds also have the biggest vocabularies in general.
Oh. So
I don't believe that this is causal, by the way. I don't think that, probably what it is that the kids who are most interested in language, most adept at language, most interested in the nuances. Oh, this word gets used here, but not there. Oh, I wonder what this word does. I wonder what the social work is that this word does. I think those kids are most likely to learn the most about language in general, including the dirty stuff.
Right. Well, I agree with you. I don't think there's any evidence that it causes harm. But maybe indirectly, if I'll just make the devil's advocate argument for, say, the conservative position that, we should clean up our language for the same reason of the broken windows theory of crime. That indirectly, that if somebody comes into a neighborhood with graffiti and broken windows, it's sort of a proxy or a signal that no one cares about this neighborhood. So what difference does it make what I do? I can get away with it. There's less authority. There's no shadow of enforcement watching over, so more likely to break into the car or whatever. But clean up the graffiti in the subways of New York. This was that theory that
the Giuliani.
Yeah.
Sure.
So
we see where that's gone. Right?
Yeah. So would that not, or like the cognitive or the social psych experiments? That if you have a dirty laptop screen or a environment desk that you're sitting at, you're changes your behavior,
People
primes you,
morally, right?
assuming anyone actually ever did that research.
Yeah, I'm not sure those, so there's been a lot of failures to replicate in that particular subfield, so I'm not sure whether that one holds up. But so I guess there are two obvious rejoinders to that. The first is, you could say that about any fashion, right? So why should we be making sure that, that people don't wear short pants? We should be making sure that people don't wear short pants because we don't like people to wear short pants. And if people realize that they can wear short pants, then anything's going to go.
I see.
Right. And words are a very similar fashion. I mean, you cannot convince even a proponent of that view that that the word zounds ought to be prohibited in a similar way. And they'll say, oh well, because it's not a bad word, but it was a bad word.
Right.
It is. The particular set of words are purely fashion. They are purely the product of this particular historical moment, which is, subject to indoctrination in the brains of young children on a daily basis, where the fact that it's totally arbitrary sort of makes it makes the argument fall apart. The second rejoinder would be, okay, let's say you would adopt that approach. Let's say you ban any set of words that let's say you can even agree on what the right set of words is to ban. Guess what you've just done? You've just made those words more powerful.
Right.
The only reason those words are agreed, so to the extent that we agree which words are the bad words, the only reason we agree is because we all had the same childhood experiences where people said those are the bad words, don't say those. Those are the words that are most powerful, are the words that we're told you can't say in public or that you can't say around children. They are powerful because we were told those things, because we were punished. So you can go ahead and do that, but it will have exactly the opposite consequence.
So would you recommend that the FCC just drop it entirely and the motion picture, just drop it, let people say whatever they want to say as an experiment?
Well, I mean, that experiment is happening, right? That experiment is happening on cable television and satellite radio.
Right.
And what you see is, effectively a free market, and it's not the Wild West exactly, right? So you don't see on, pick your favorite on Lifetime, or pick your favorite television channel. You don't see them constantly swearing the worst possible words of the language. And why don't you? Well, because that's not what the viewers and the advertisers want.
Right.
So maybe the FCC is kind of redundant, actually.
Right.
If the people who are watching broadcast television and listening to broadcast radio, vote with their ears and eyes and vote with their dollars, then you'll probably end up with something that looks a lot like Lifetime.
Right.
So I think that they're actually totally redundant at this point.
It's more effective if you selectively use it in any case. If you just use it as every other word as a profanity, then it loses its impact.
Yeah, we were talking about that with someone else earlier. So Netflix has these original series, which are a really great example of this, because they could in principle use as much profanity as they want, but because of strategic decisions, some of the shows have decided to use profanity selectively. So we were talking about a show called BoJack Horseman, which uses exactly one profanity per season. Well, one use of the word fuck per season, and apparently the creator did this as an intentional strategy. There's a point in season 1 and a point in season 2 if you've seen it, and it's the points of greatest like internal psychic conflict on the part of BoJack Horseman, where that one word is used, and it really does pack a punch exactly because he's been on a diet of fucks for the entire season. So I think that they're totally redundant at this point.
remember when Howard Stern was on broadcast radio rather than cable, and he would constantly poke the FCC with little bits to get around it. Like one of them was Jackie the Joke Man and Robin would fill in the blank. So it was like, blank, a doodle do. And then Jackie would write, cock. And he'd say, and I wrote mine in really big letters, so mine's a big cock.
Right. Yeah, so there's this really funny thing. So with the FCC, because they don't have there's not a list of words, and even you can sort of get around it. So this is something that people have been playing with forever. You know, you can say things that are far worse than what the FCC bans, as long as you talk around them. But also, there's this really challenging issue, which you're bringing up, which is that many of these words actually have multiple uses, right? So profane words don't usually come out of nowhere. Sometimes they do. But usually they don't come out of nowhere. They come from a place where a word had another meaning. So cock is like that. Bitch is like that. Fag is like that. Ass is like that. Lots of these words are like, fuck is actually like that. Fuck originally means something like to strike or hit in the deep history of English 1,000 years ago. And so at a particular point in time, what people object to is not the word as a whole with all of its heterogeneous meanings, but a particular use of the word, right? A particular way of using that word, and how do you legislate that?
Right.
So obviously.
But rooster was sort of introduced as a counter to cock, right?
Yeah, rooster was invented a couple hundred years ago as a word. The word cock goes back to the beginning of English as far as we can tell. But starting in the 16th century or so, it started to be used with this second meaning, which is male genitalia. And that struck some people, puritanical Americans in particular, as an unstable state of affairs because they wanted to be able to refer to just the animal without having this other sense associated. So they invented a word for this animal. They called it by the name of the place that it hangs out most of the day. So it sits in a roost, so it's a rooster. And this word has mostly caught on in the United States. It hasn't caught on in Great Britain, for example, where they know that we call it a rooster, but they think that we're sort of silly for doing that and puritanical. So there's lots of really interesting linguistic innovation that happens around profanity to kind of avoid it and work your way around it to avoid stumbling into things that you might not intend.
Right. My wife's from Germany, so she's constantly amazed by American media. Obsession over language or sex on TV, but they'll show people getting blown to bits in war. That's perfectly fine. Look at all the dead bodies and the heads. But if a nipple gets shown during the Super Bowl, oh my God, or he used that word. So maybe it's the influence of religion that the Europeans have largely dropped compared to Americans.
And we have it not just in media, but in public discourse. And can you imagine a Freud in the beginning of the 20th century in this country?
Oh gosh,
right? Right. Wouldn't have existed.
Right,
He couldn't have said the things that written the things that he wrote.
Right. Some of the other myths that like fuck comes from to pluck, or the middle finger is an erect penis, and so on. I mean, some of these may be true, but a lot of these sort of amateur linguists just make up stories about the origin of words, and a lot of it comes from that, right? Just people making stuff up.
Yeah, people are seeking explanations. I think it's exciting that people are interested in language enough that they invent explanations for why the words that they have are the way that they are. So many people think that the word fuck comes from an acronym of one variety or another. So for unlawful carnal knowledge is one example that I've seen in my inbox a couple of times. No, it has nothing to do with that. It's a much older word than carnal or knowledge are. Like I said, it goes back to hitting or striking. These folk etymologies, they persist around lots of language. It's just that people are most interested, I think, in profane words, and so we see the mythology there the most.
Right. But most of it just happens so slowly enough that over the course of a few years, you're just using it without even thinking about the origin, like 9/11. We just started calling it 9/11. I don't even know how it started. Maybe New York Times headline or whatever. Yeah. Or MILF, another one of the ones you talk about. Right. I mean, maybe that'll just be a word at some point. It almost is a word now.
Yeah, I think so. No, I actually did this last week. I asked my undergrads what it meant. And not all my undergrads. This is a particular class that I teach, which is an uncensored introduction to language, where we, this is not the ones in the sort of brain and language class. This is the ones who are interested in this material specifically, and they all had a very specific idea about what the acronym was. So now, at least, it hasn't become just a word yet. It's still decomposed into its component words. But there's no reason to believe that in decades it couldn't be. Ultimately.
Right. So maybe that's how it happens. So, that gets us to the larger question of the origins of language. How did it all come about? To what extent is it adaptive? Is it a byproduct of some other cognitive function? If you think about it, our capacity to transfer thoughts where we started from one brain to another, that's what we're doing. And you can do it through language, but now we can also do it in writing. These are just black and white, black scribbles on a white page. Surely we didn't adapt the ability to do that over the last 100,000 years, and it just popped up 5,000 years ago.
Right.
So to what extent is this a Darwinian adaptation versus just sort of a byproduct of something else going on?
Yeah. Well, let's start at the beginning. We don't know. We don't know. We don't even know when humans started doing something language-like. Like, we don't even know within an order of magnitude. It could have been like 50,000 years ago when we have, all the markings of, cultural, symbolic representations, cave paintings, that kind of thing. It could have been 10 times that length of time. We really don't know, of course, because we don't have records of what people were saying to one another in the time before records. So that we don't know. Second, there are a lot of theories of exactly what the first steps must have been for language to get off the ground. One promising idea that's sort of connected to the ideas that we've been talking about today is that humans started with a capacity to vocalize, to express emotions in a really basic way, a lot like other primates. So if you study other primates, vervet monkeys, for example, they have systems of shrieks, calls that they use to warn other monkeys that there's a particular type of predator around. So here's the squawk for an eagle, here's the squawk for a jaguar, and they're distinct, and you know that they sound distinct, and not only that, but other conspecifics, other vervet monkeys, when they hear those squawks, respond appropriately. They look up in the air after the eagle squawk, and they look down at the ground after the snake squawk. So they are communicating something. So it turns out that these systems are very similar to the structure of the system that we use for producing profanity spontaneously, in that they don't use these left lateralized cortical structures at all. They're systems that loop in the cortex along with the limbic system, homologs of the basal ganglia. So there's reason to believe that this alternate system for vocalizing that monkeys have, that dogs have, is something that we had at the time when we started using language more creatively. And it may have been the thing that sort of bootstrapped it. Like, maybe we were running around producing strong emotional signals when we were excited, when we were frustrated, when we were angry, and that proto form of communication, that nascent communication, was the thing that got the rest started, right? So if you were able to communicate a little bit better, then you could convey more complicated ideas. You could express ideas not just about a threat right here, right now, but a threat that's coming later, or you could recount what happened earlier so that you can transmit knowledge, history, science, all that stuff that comes when you dissociate the signal from the here and now. Of course, there are lots of other ideas. One idea is that language started actually in the manual modality, that people started signing to one another. And there's some good evidence for this that comes from, among other things, the fact that all humans are able to learn signed languages, just as they're able to learn spoken languages. They're actually able to learn signed languages starting earlier in development as infants than they can learn spoken languages. And there are a number of different signed language systems that exist around the world that have sprouted up independently. It seems to happen spontaneously whenever you have a group of people who can't hear. All of a sudden, a new language sprouts up, and it's a language that's equally communicative to a spoken language. So some people believe that it's But that's
Oh yeah, you've got this picture of this woman saying fucking sign language, but you know she looks angry. She looks like, you know, fuck you, as opposed to, you know, something a little bit lighter. So it must be a whole it's body language.
It's not just the hands. Yeah. So in sign language, that's British Sign Language. In sign languages, yes, it's not just the hands that communicate. The face communicates. The posture communicates. The sort of the dynamics, how fast you do stuff, is useful for communication. And some people think that that's how language got started. Obviously, there are a lot of useful things that language is used for, and it would be. The debate is hard, right? Because it would be surprising if it just emerged spontaneously as a freak genetic mutation, and all of a sudden, you know, the first caveman came out and said, "Hey guys, look what I can do," and no one else could understand. But that's basically what Chomsky claims.
Right.
That would be surprising. At the same time, you don't want to say that all of the functions that language now serves are the things that it adapted for, because that's a totally teleological type of explanation. That's just saying, you know, here's what it does, that must be why it is. And we don't know that. You need to find some other evidence.
Right.
So it's a tricky area.
We had an article in Skeptic a few years ago by a professional tracker, animal tracker, who's also a historian of science. So the article was ostensibly about the origins of thinking scientifically, that is, testing hypotheses, like formulating ideas and then making a prediction based on it, and then checking the prediction. And so his model of that was, when you're he's hired by hunters to go out in the bush and track animals, and because they don't know how to do it. So he looks, essentially it's like a theory of mind. I'm mind reading the animal. So I see the tracks, and then I see like a big pod here, like we laid down, and you can see how long ago that they laid here, then he went that way, and the weather is this, so he's probably doing, you're putting yourself in their mind, and you're going, okay, so if he's doing this at that time and the weather's like this, he's probably thinking there's water over there, or there's berries over there, or there's prey over there, and you're essentially then becoming like the animal. You're putting yourself into the animal's mind. And then you got to communicate that with your fellow hunters somehow. Right. So maybe there's some link from hunting to, and gathering or whatever, to language.
That's one of the, so, you know, there's a dozen popular explanations. One of them has to do with collaborative hunting. Sometimes it's tracking, sometimes it's hunting big prey. So let's say you want to take down a really big land animal that you can't possibly take down yourself. You're going to need to coordinate, right? You know, you guys go that way, you guys go that way. Now, wolves can do it themselves without language, but you know they're not.
How do they do it? Just barks and.
We don't know. No,
they just do it.
No, yeah, they don't seem to do it using barks. No, yeah, wolves, coyotes. If you've ever seen them, they're amazing hunters. These pack hunters. No, they seem to know. We two are going to go. We're going to take the high road, and we're going to scare them out of the bush, and the rest are going to wait out here. They just do it. It's cultural learning, but you know, not through language. But you know, so if you were going to do it dynamically, and you wanted to do it, you know, in a way that was robust to new circumstances that are, you know, more complicated, things that you haven't encountered before, then yeah, language could be super helpful. Other people say that language came around the campfire.
Oh, right.
That's a popular hypothesis. Is that so once you've invented fire and you have access to a lot more calories for a lot more protein in particular, because you can preserve meat, you're going to spend a lot of time with fire around you, and it just so happens that when you're around the fire at night, it's hard to communicate with your hands. Because you know, you've got the fire there, and it's in the way. You've got your hands are full of, you know, all the stuff that you're doing. You're sharpening bones. You're doing whatever it is, and it's dark, so you can't really see very well. And there's all this smoke, but you can hear each other. And so maybe that's where language jumped into vocal modality.
Melvin Connor, his essay in the Wall Street Journal yesterday was about that.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and he cited some study of modern peoples that, you know, if you meet in the mornings for coffee or you meet for lunch or whatever, there are different kinds of conversations than campfire conversations, which are more important, deeper. You know, the rest are more gossipy, but these are more important, about power, you know, gods, the meaning of life, whatever. Right. Yeah.
I believe it.
Maybe. I mean, it's one of those things that's it's hard for you guys because it's not fossilized. I don't know where this research is now, but in the 90s there was something about the structure of the skull from, you know, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and so on, implying that if you have this little bump here, it means you have this other thing, which means you might have a vocal box. Right. That's so inferential, but I don't know what people think about that now. So we certainly know that we have evolved in ways that make language
possible. So other primates can't manipulate their tongues and their mouths with as much dexterity as we can, and that has to do in part with just the number of nerve fibers that can pass through the aperture in the skull. And our voice box happens to be positioned in this really convenient place so that we can control our breathing, and we can do this really delicate ballet where we manipulate our vocal cords. We bring them together so that they vibrate. We bring them a little bit further apart so that we sound sexy, and we can bring them even farther apart so that we can have voiceless sounds like s and so on that don't actually involve frication at the larynx or closure of the larynx at all. We can do lots of stuff that other animals don't seem to have that sort of nuance. Other primates don't have that subtle control. So that's there. Whether that preceded a conceptual leap and a neurological leap to language, or whether it was the thing that then made it possible to communicate via language, we don't know, because the timing we could be off by 100,000 years in either direction.
Right. So we have a lot of students here, sort of wrapping up this portion of the day. What would you recommend? So the future of psychology, cog science, linguistics. What areas really need exploring, research, experiments? All of it, yeah. I mean, there's just not that much. I was amazed at how little there has been done.
So profanity is a really interesting topic, but there's so much exciting research happening right now. I stumbled into exactly what to me is the most exciting area to be in, which is cognitive science. It's at the nexus of neuroscience, which, as we know, is experiencing quantum leaps on a seemingly annual basis in terms of what we can measure, how we measure it, what we can manipulate in brains. It's a nexus of neuroscience with big data. When you're recording from thousands of neurons now, every millisecond, you have huge, vast assemblies of data, and you need to be able to figure out what's in there. You need to be able to analyze and understand it, and we are now developing the statistical tools, not me. People smarter than me are developing the statistical tools to tease apart that stuff using machine learning and deep learning, all the stuff that makes Google billions of dollars, but is also allowing us to understand what's happening in the brain in real time. At the same time, we have sensor systems. We can record, you've got digital video cameras here. Digital video cameras, not of this quality, are basically free.
Yeah.
And you can record terabytes of data of humans interacting in the world. So if you want to understand the interaction between brains and bodies, brains and behavior, which is kind of what neuroscience, what cognitive science offers as the tantalizing possibility, then you have two really rich sources of data, and you can use, again, those same new computational techniques to automatically classify whether a person was moving this way or moving this way, whether they were blinking, whether they were looking one direction or another. You can measure their temperature from a video camera. You can determine what was happening in their peripheral nervous system from video. And so the sky is really the limit. To me, computation, neuroscience, and behavior are really, we're going to know so much more. We're going to know so much more in 10 years than we know now.
There's that TED Talk, I forget the guy's name, who set up cameras around his house to record every utterance of his newborn.
Right, yeah, Deb Roy.
Yeah, that's it. And just had reams of data, and I remember thinking, well, how do you know which is the important stuff? Just so much.
You didn't at the time, right? He did this, it must be 6 or 7 years ago now. I think it was that long ago.
Right, yeah.
And at the time, it was like, he's got terabytes of data.
Right.
Now it's like, I've got terabytes of data on my phone.
Yes, right. Yeah.
It's not. Right. If you were to do that exercise now, you would have way more cameras, and you would sample at a much higher sampling rate. So you get really nuanced video and audio, higher quality, and yeah, these tools are amazing. People are able to find a word in a web haystack. They can do that. They can do that from audio as well.
Well, that will settle the dispute of whether the first word was mama or papa or dada.
In their case, I don't remember what it was.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think he ever published that.
No, I don't think so.
That's probably why.
So, what's the next book? How do you top something as interesting as this?
Well, this only took me 7 years, so invite me back in
Okay.
2023. We'll be maybe it'll be about going to Mars or whatever we're doing then.
That's right. I wonder if with the AI, if there'll be cursing robots, or if they'll build that in not to do that, or if it'll just evolve naturally in a learning AI.
Oh, there already are. I mean, so this is so if Facebook had this problem. Anyone who tries to use the web as a corpus to train a language system in an AI is going to have a bad day.
Oh, okay.
Because they turn into these. They turn into slurring. Generally bad intentioned little agents. Yeah.
Remember, Data on Star Trek never used contractions. Like why that would be an AI thing, I don't know.
Well, I think this was the late 80s, right? Maybe in the late 80s, people the public wasn't quite prepared for exactly what AI was going to be, and so they sort of thought about it as this sort of mechanical man kind of thing still. Right.
Well, I want to be sensitive to our audience and our time, so please thank our guest today. And
thank you.
Appreciate that. So now we'd like to hear from you. If you have comments, questions, stories, curse words that you've long wanted to say in public. Anyone? Yes?
You covered in your book around page 23, so I just looked it up, how, only because I was around a bunch of Japanese students around 10 years ago, talk about Japan, and you talked about the 007 movie where they accidentally had this humongous amount of really good information.
Yes, so it turns out that if you look across the world's languages, not everyone has the same attitude towards words that we have, that they're these bad words, right? And they're the words that you can't say in public, and we have to bleep them, and you can't say them around kids, and kids have to be protected from them. So you could turn, for example, to France. That would be a good place to start, where, there are some bad words. Foutre, putain, these are very bad words. But they're not censored. At least not like those words, they're basically equivalent. Both of them are sort of used equivalently to fuck. They're just not used in that way. You would see them, you see them around kids, you see them used by kids, you see them used by politicians, you see them on the evening news. They just don't have that attitude about censorship, that they shouldn't be allowed in public. And Japan is the same way. So there are a couple words in Japanese that are a little bit offensive, but there's nothing like the idea that, here's a set of words, we should have an organ of government or an industry organization like the MPAA that should be charged with making sure that kids don't get exposed to these. So you can offend people in Japan, you can insult them, you can call their ancestors animals and all kinds of bad things, and you can use the wrong honorific form. So instead of calling them by a high status word, you can use a low status word, and they could be totally offended by that and it would be inappropriate. But it's not like the words themselves would be bad words. So even the strongest ones like kso, which is often used in anime, it's sort of this it's been borrowed into Korean and Chinese anime and stuff like that. It means shit, but it's you see it in Hello Kitty. It's not,
The number 4 and how it sounds like death. They get a little weird about that. But that's about as close as I ever. I was actually trying to push the button and there was no button there. But I had a pin for a comic that's called She, which is death/4, and it's an American comic based on Japanese stuff. But the pin that you put the Japanese students physically reacted, they jumped back kind of. Their reaction to the number 4 is our reaction supposedly to the number 13. There's no 13th floor in a building.
Right, but maybe even worse.
Yeah,
right.
I would say worse.
It's similar in China. There are no 4th floors.
Really? Oh wow. Yeah.
I think one of your conclusions is that the heavy use of swear words is not correlated with a poor vocabulary.
Right. Well, there are a couple of experiments showing that. Yeah.
But I think why does it seem that way? I remember my teacher saying that heavy cussing is the attempt of a feeble mind to express itself. And that's hit home with my classes.
Yeah.
And I think we all have that experience, that it seems that when you encounter someone that swears every other word,
Right.
you think, well, that person doesn't have much vocabulary, so this is the way that they get by in the world.
Right.
And maybe if they weren't
Yeah.
using, if they had a non-swear word, if they just said, wow every few words instead of, that would be a similar effect. But why do we all have that experience that it seems like someone who does cuss so much doesn't have vocabulary, but your conclusion seems to be the opposite?
Well, so that is one of these cultural beliefs that we have about language, and we have so many of them. So think about, over the last decade, there's been a lot of talk about a couple of things. Upspeak, where especially young women will end their clauses by going up a little, and how this shouldn't be on radio or on television. And there's another one that's called vocal fry. So, that people will end their sentences like this. And that's really offensive. Or it shows that you really don't care. And young people report that they hear this from their parents and their teachers all the time. So this is what my undergrads will tell me that they're told. Don't say don't say like, don't swear obviously, don't talk like this. And there's no evidence that this is, a degraded mind produces vocal fry at the end of a clause.
Well, it can't be. All of my students talk like this, and they can't all be degraded minds.
That's right. Yeah. So I think it is a way of exercising social control, right? To say this way of talking that's not like, which again, it could be fashion, right? It could be clothes. Don't wear your pants sagging. Why not? Because it's immoral, because it's a gateway form of, because you're gonna, whatever, right? It is a way, we tell these stories to ourselves and to our children to indoctrinate them into particular belief systems. And when you hear it as a child, like when you're told that there's a hell and that you have to behave because otherwise, you believe it, because why wouldn't you?
Right.
So as an adult, it still seems to you that way, unless you've really scrutinized that fundamental belief.
Right.
But if I told you, for example, so I like to think of myself as a relatively smart guy. I'm not as smart as the people, like I said, the guys doing the machine learning and the computational deep learning stuff. Okay, but I'm a relatively smart guy. I swear a lot.
Yeah.
Not when I'm presenting, not when I'm, trying to hold forth and, show myself to be a distinguished member of society, but, after the kid goes to bed, I've got a 2-year-old, after the kid goes to bed, my wife and I have, a lot to say about how well nap time went, given that we're trying to potty train him. Yeah, there's a lot of profanity. I don't think that that's a sign that I'm less intelligent in those moments than I am when I'm standing and delivering in front of the faculty senate.
If I'm not mistaken, it seems like one thing that you've been saying is that profanities have evolved from mainly describing bodily functions and things like that to describing derogatory terms for various groups of people. How do you think profanities will evolve in the future?
Yeah. That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
I'm not a futurist. I don't know what it takes to be a futurist. I think maybe you just have to say what you think is going to happen in the future.
Yes,
and then
that's
that
it.
makes you, okay, so I'm a futurist. I think that, so in the near term, I think we can be pretty sure what's going to happen, which is that the terms that younger people find less and less offensive are going to continue to be less and less offensive. And that's going to be just a continuation of the same process that's been happening for centuries, where words that are strong in one decade fall out of strength in the next. So my parents did not want to hear me say the word sucks at home. They thought that was, I'm 40, they thought that was like, how could you possibly, like, obviously we know exactly what you're talking about. It falls into that category of sexual language, inappropriate at home. And it wasn't allowed and I was punished for it. And my son will never have any idea that suck was ever a bad word. He'll probably think it's less bad than stupid. Calling someone stupid is probably worse for him in his generation than to say that something sucks. So these words will not be as bad as they once were. Fuck will probably, give it 2 generations. I would be surprised if so it's already, what is it now, the 15th worst word in the language according to UCLA undergrads. I bet I bet it won't even make the list. It'll probably.
By 2050, people go, why didn't
what
he
was
use?
this?
Why just the F?
So there is another F word that's far more offensive, which is faggot. So it may be replaced as the F word.
Right.
So that's one thing that will probably continue to happen because it happens inevitably. And then the second thing is that as people's cultural beliefs about what types of activities are inappropriate for public discourse, as they continue to evolve, the words associated with those beliefs will continue to become more offensive. So if we continue to live in a setting where we're denigrating people, dehumanizing people by dint of their social group status is thought to be inappropriate, those words will get even stronger. And they will get stronger because those words will be banned. So we were talking earlier about, we didn't get to that here, although I know it was something that's on your mind. There is this movement afoot, even on college campuses, to ban particular words from particular settings, right? To say that this is a safe space, this word or this set of words is not appropriate for this higher institution of free speech and free thought. And that movement comes from a good place, I think. It comes from a place where we want to be respectful of people and their belief systems. But the consequence is probably going to be exactly the same as what censorship always does, which is that those words are going to become stronger. When you know that a word is inappropriate, it's unacceptable, you're going to be punished for it, then that word takes on special cachet. It's just like when you ban drinking for people under 21. It's just like when you do abstinence-only education for sex in Mississippi, and the birth rate goes up with unwed juveniles. I mean, it's exactly the same thing. You tell kids not to do something, and all of a sudden that's the coolest thing there is, and it's the strongest.
There's a movie out now called Denial, about the libel trial against by David Irving against Deborah Lipstadt in 1999. Deborah Lipstadt is a Holocaust historian who wrote a book about the Holocaust deniers, in which she called David Irving, who is a sort of self-taught historian, who was one of the first to challenge the idea that the Holocaust happened the way we think it did. Anyway, she called him a denier. He said, "I'm not a denier, I'm a revisionist," which is a more respectable idea, because all historians are revisionists in a way. And so in England, it's reversed than it is here. When you're sued for libel, you have to prove that you did not libel the plaintiff, and that the burden of proof is on you to show that you didn't. Well, she won this case, but it's an interesting one because that word, denial, that's where it got started in terms of as a pejorative use with the Holocaust deniers. Now there's the climate deniers and the vaccine deniers and the evolution deniers, and it's sort of spread as an epithet, that it's an insult. It's, right. You are worst. That's not skepticism, because we do skepticism. That's proper. Scientists are skeptics, and being revisionist, well, historians do that. Denial is something else. And that's why he didn't like that and sued for it. Interestingly, I called him a denier in our issue in Skeptic and in my own book, and he didn't sue me. I'm not Jewish, and he's very well, I think. There's a power thing there. Those Jews are doing stuff, and we're going to call them out on it, that sort of thing. So there was something else going on with the language taking on that meaning. And since then, that word has now been used all over the place, particularly with climate deniers. Because we really mean something by that. They are not just, in an open debate in science like we have, but they're doing something really bad. Right. Anyway, just a little side note. Mark, back there, yeah.
Following up on your comments about how words have switched positions, and it seems like, and I haven't seen the whole list, that words that are racist, sexist, anti-gay, anti-immigrant have moved into the category of being unacceptable. And I also see this as very good and connected to the rise of those social movements, right? The word nigger used to be very acceptable, except then giving the rise of the civil rights movement, Malcolm X, King, and others. Same thing with the women's movement and derogatory terms, and now with the rise of, lesbian and gay movement and immigrant movement, etc. And that those four-letter words that are more offensive, move down on the list. And I connect this also to the actions and these presidential debates and the back and forth, that things that one of the candidates says that are considered now totally unacceptable 30 years ago were perfectly acceptable. The actions, the words, etc. And to me, it shows a progressive move in society, right? Of not using these words that people find offensive, and it's their right to say that it's offensive.
Is it progressive or just changing?
I think that it's inevitably linked to the empowerment of social groups, right? So the reason that 18 to 22-year-olds think that, I have a lot to say about 18 to 22-year-olds because I have them in my classes, so I can ask them things. I don't know anything about people between the age of 2 and 18. It may not even exist, but one of the reasons that younger people find the word retard so offensive is because there has been a self-conscious movement to make people aware that this could be an offensive term. And so they see videos on Facebook where people give attestations. They talk testimonials about, hey, I have, my brother has Down syndrome, and I find it hurts me and it hurts him to hear that word. That word hurts. And, people have communicated that message about that word, and it has been heard, and that has changed attitudes. I don't think it's random chance that that word happens now at this particular moment when rights of people who are differently abled are so much coming into the forefront of our public consciousness that the two have happened at the same time. I don't think that's a coincidence.
Yeah, it's like you watch speeches by Dr. King, and he refers to Negroes, and even that it doesn't sound bad, but it sounds a little off, like, whoa, we haven't used that word in decades. And colored, then people of color is now acceptable, colored is not. But in decades hence, African American or people of color may not be acceptable. But I'm not sure this is progress, it's just changing words or something. But go ahead.
Well, a lot of those words you just said I find to be totally acceptable, but the word that I still do not find to be acceptable is the one that you've used a lot. And every time it's said, it's amazing what it elicits in me. But it's really, here, the way you're saying it, it's not really said to harm, but it's how it's said.
Right.
My son, when he moved to California, he wrote an essay to get a scholarship, and he said that he was literally called that word every single day in a prep school.
Wow.
And it was done in a way to basically really it was done in such a negative and harmful way. So it's really how it's done. It's used as a weapon. It's used as a tool. And I think that's the part that really makes the big difference. It's what the intent is, and again, the power differential. Yeah. And it's amazingly, it is harmful. But if it's not that word, it will be another word. It's really what's behind it that I think is where that the issue is.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you could ban. So imagine no one ever uses that word again. What would be solved, right? Would racism be solved, right? Would aggression be solved, right? So yes, and it's a fascinating thing about that word. It has been reappropriated. There are people who use a different version of it. So there's this use that I talk about in the book that's completely removed. It's a use that's been documented by a couple of native speakers of African American English at the University of Pennsylvania, which is a nigga, and it means something like I. So I think that, so they document it in a bunch of tweets, but something like a nigga proud of myself in African American English. Okay, it means I. Now, that's not offensive to the people who said it. It's not offensive to people in their social group because they're using it in a way that they've all agreed this is a way that we talk, right? So it's very obviously, it's not the word. So the word has very strong associations for a lot of people. That's why it shows up as it's a full 2 points more offensive than any other word in the English language, according to young people.
Yeah, you have the quote from Tupac Shakur. Niggers was the one on the rope hanging off the thing. Niggas is the ones with gold ropes hanging out at clubs.
Right. So this is there obviously there are different uses of it, but solving So nothing's going to be solved by banning the word, as far as I can tell, except for making it more powerful. It's those other things If you solve those other things, then it goes away. And
although in principle, it seems like going back to say the women's movement. Just little things like instead of always saying he, say he or she, right. Or just the way we refer to women. it feels like it should make a difference in our cognition, and then cognition leads to behavioral change. I mean, that's the theory.
Right. Yeah, so that's right, that's the theory. And in principle, if you were able to start with carte blanche, you were able to start with a brand new word and say, okay, us, we want to be called XYZ. And there are no associations with XYZ. It's a completely new word. It sounds like no other word in the language. Then yes, if there were no other prior biases, if we, my social group, was not already being marginalized or being stereotyped to be in a particular way or had subject to a particular power differential, then sure, you could start over. And the language, that new language might help. The problem is that doesn't exist in the vacuum.
It's like my father would refer to women as gals,
right.
And I would not use that word.
Right.
Now, it's not offensive so much as just sort of, I don't know, demeaning or I'm not sure what it is, but it doesn't feel right. And there must be a bunch of those words in the middle. They're not really profanity,
right.
But they're just not quite equality type words.
So I'm curious, just kind of touch on what you were talking about, Michael, and your comment as well about kind of the visceral reaction. And forgive me, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm curious if you are familiar with any kind of research that was done around pornography, because that's definitely an arena where there's language that's used that some could consider offensive, but then others are very viscerally moved, and it's there's an arousal or a sensitivity that is a positive. So I'm just wondering if you can expand on that.
Yeah, okay, so there's this fascinating thing that happens with humans and their emotional reactions to things, which is that there are a lot of stimuli in the environment that trigger the same physiological response, and what you think you're experiencing, elation, anger, sexual arousal, depends on your mindset and what you think you're experiencing, what the context is like. And so those same words trigger this suite of physiological responses, the adrenaline, the increased heart rate, all that stuff, and that's true regardless. You bring people into the lab in a completely sterile setting. They're sitting there, with headphones, staring at a monitor, and you give them these strongest words of the language. You can measure changes in their skin conductance, right? They start sweating. All that stuff starts happening reliably for profanity and not for just run-of-the-mill words. How you interpret that physiological response that your body is experiencing depends on everything else in the setting. So in a lab, you might not think much of it. But if you're suspended from, if you're rock climbing and and all of a sudden you get this rush of adrenaline and your palms start sweating, well, maybe you think it's fear. Maybe if you're watching pornography, you think that it's sexual excitement, right? So the physiology is quite similar. I mean, there are some differences, of course, but a lot of the physiology that's triggered by the words is similar, and your experience, your subjective experience of whether it's arousal, sexual arousal, or whether it's fear or elation is based on your current mindset.
Hi, to piggyback on that, so you talk about big data as well and how being in the lab is different than being out in the setting. I recently read an article about this man was wearing a Fitbit. It's like a counter, but his in particular, that model also had his heart rate, and it caught the hour before and like the day after his girlfriend broke up with him, and there was a clear change in data in his heart rate throughout the day, and he actually compared it to the day that he had run a marathon. And so when we're gathering data, we usually think of an experiment where we're controlling everything, but do you think there's an application too for things like that, where what we have ourselves on, whether it's like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or something, where we can, if we're drafted into an experiment like this, we can submit our own information from what previously has happened and say like, oh, my mom had a heart attack and she was wearing this monitor and this is the data I can give you, or whether it's ourselves, or I suffered from a breakup, or I was in a really big, I was almost assaulted and this is what I was having. Do you think that there's something that's going to be going into the field now in the future?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, a lot of science is not experimental science. right? Astronomy is mostly not experimental science. You can't make the stars do something. You just watch and collect a bunch of data, and then you try to figure out what the patterns are. A lot of neuroscience is not experimental, right? You just want to know, do neurons over here, does their pattern of behavior relate, and in what ways to the behavior of these neurons over here, independent of how you manipulate the animal. And we are, as you say, collecting a lot of data on ourselves already. I mean, not as much as Google is, but we're collecting a lot of data about ourselves as we have these devices attached to us. And I think it's inevitable as sensors get better, as microprocessors get even more micro, that we're going to have whole sensor networks on our bodies. I mean, some people already do, but even with just your Fitbit and your phone and your Google Watch and your or Apple Watch and whatever else you have, you may have dozens and dozens of sensors on you, and our ability to pull out meaningful patterns from that data is already amazing and far better than you would ever think, but certainly will be turned into something useful by the next generation of inventors.
Yep.
Slightly different aspect, coming back to swearing. Have you, in your studies, encountered any sort of experiences where non-native speaker, how they perceive the same, the fucks and whatevers of the world versus their own equivalents in their native language?
Yes, there have been a number of studies on that by a group at Boston University. The basic finding is this: if you present people with profanity in their native language, they get this large physiological response, increased heart rate, blood pressure, sweating, all that kind of stuff. If you present it in writing, they get less of a response. If you present them in a second language, one that they learned after the age of 13, you get even less of a response. This seems to kind of jibe with what a lot of people feel about the swears that they learn in a second language. So I know when I learned French, the first thing I wanted to learn was the swear words, of course, because that's that's what you in high school, that's what you want to learn. But those words never have felt particularly strong to me. They're fun because they're a way to swear and get a reaction from people if you use them really well. But no, they don't seem to have, for most people, the same sort of deep-seated physiological basis, and that's probably because the settings in which we learn them don't have that strong negative reinforcer, right? You're not told, don't say this, this is bad, I'm going to get the soap,
That's such a funny thing, watching somebody's mouth. That was so.
It's a metaphor made literal, right?
Yeah,
you have a dirty mouth.
Yeah.
But it's like, I mean, we literalize all these metaphors, right? I mean, look at Macbeth.
Right. Oh yeah.
You wash the sin away, right? Or baptism,
right? I actually have a bar of Wash Away Your Sin soap. It cleanses 99.8% of all guilt.
I have two questions actually. The first one is the numbers on the graphs that you have in the first chapter or so about the offensiveness of words. Where was this data collected? Was it nationwide or was it in specific regions?
Those are all different ones. So you're interested in the U.S. ones?
Let's say
There are two U.S. ones. One was actually collected. The smaller one was collected on something called Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a work platform where people can they can create an account, log on, and they do little jobs for a little bit of money. So like, is this picture a picture of a cat or a dog? Do that 5,000 times. Okay, here's $2. And a lot of researchers are now using that for experiments too. You give people minimum wage, and they answer questions like, how offensive is this word? So that's a pretty broad sample of the U.S. Actually, if you look at the demographics, it skews, mean and median age is somewhere in the 30s, I think. Skews more male than female, but not a ton. Skews educated, but not super educated. Decent. I mean, obviously people with computers or mobile devices, so it's pretty representative. The other one is UCLA undergrads.
Okay.
So
So I just
obviously
find it
not.
interesting how the N word is not on the first one, but it is the top one.
Oh yeah, so the text in there explains that that first one wasn't actually asking about slurs. So that one is all words except for slurs.
Got it.
That's why it doesn't show up there.
So my second question is, you speak a lot about the language and the offensive words in the English language. Have you done any research or have you looked into maybe Latin America and how they're offensive? They find the words offensive, because I was just there recently and they can cuss left and right, every other word is a cuss word, but nobody gets offended. But as soon as somebody says, well, that's not what your mom said last night, then the people start throwing at each other. So it's kind of interesting how you can say and offend someone to the maximum, as long as you don't mention your mom.
Yeah. Well, remember the difference between a word, because the word mother is not offensive.
Right.
Right? It's that linguistic act that is a denigrating act, right? So yeah, there's actually chapter 1 goes through, sort of does the tour of the world and of spoken languages, and then chapter 3 does signed languages and looks at how they differ across the world. Yeah, you get super different stuff. So in Russia, it's mostly words revolving around sex and body and organs, and same in Cantonese and same in Hebrew, although they're mostly borrowed from Arabic, because biblical Hebrew didn't have any swear words, except for those forbidden religious terms that you couldn't say anyway. So they borrowed a bunch of words from Arabic, like actually a lot of other languages have, because Arabic has some really great swear words. But yeah, so there are huge differences. The biggest differences, really, in terms of how they affect people's daily lives, are in enforcement. So, is blasphemy a capital crime or not? Russia last year, they passed new legislation that you couldn't use any of the strong profanity in any sort of media. So in the arts, in plays, in music, in whatever. This is part of what Pussy Riot was objecting to. So yeah, I mean, the politics of it is really the thing that makes the biggest difference.
Is there anywhere in the book that you go into that more extensively than in chapter 1?
Chapter 1, and then we do the sort of like censorship politics in chapter 11.
Yeah. Within the United States, I've heard the more religious and the more conservative states tend to have a much higher use of pornography, for example, Utah. I'm wondering if there's similar within the United States studies about cursing.
That's a great question. I don't actually know the answer to that. To my knowledge, no one's done it. I mean, it's easier to do pornography if you're tracking people's IPs. I guess you'd need to find a place where people are equally represented and
Yeah, I
not
remember when
self-selected
that study
homocysteine.
came out, Utah, those Mormons, Right. Well, but you don't know that it's not some teenager who's not actually a Mormon that logs in, 1,000 hours more than, anybody else. and
non-Mormon?
Skews I think they weren't able to really conclude it was really religious people doing it
I
more.
haven't seen the data reflecting that.
Within the community, not
Yeah.
necessarily the Mormon.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know that the data exists on that. Good question.
Yeah.
This is probably the first work that I ever known about studying of the profanity words. And are you going to continue research on this area, where you're heading?
Well, we're doing stuff in the lab on this right now. So we're looking at these questions. There are these open questions about how it can be useful to people, whether it can be cathartic, can decrease aggression in some cases, whether it can decrease stress, improve performance. The answers to those questions are completely unknown. And so we're doing some stuff in the lab, trying to figure that out. I don't have anything to report yet, because those studies are still running. But, invite me back in 7 years, and I'll have a book called, Swear Yourself Self-Healthy or something like that.
The 7 steps to a... Yeah.
The seven letters, the 4 letters to health. 4 letters to health. Good title.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Just following up question. You have been thinking about how it can be useful. So I'm not sure this fit into your category or not. How about if your study can show these words, certain words are offensive to certain group of people?
Well, that's certainly true. I don't need a study to show that. Yeah, many of these words are offensive to. You mean that specific words are differently offensive to different groups?
Right, and I think that will create a good, usage to the society.
Well, I think
many people not in that group, they don't feel it's offensive.
Yeah, it's a little tricky. So there is some evidence on this. So like these studies, oftentimes they'll split respondents into male and female and ask them questions about, is the word, well, a word that's in the news, the word pussy. Is the word pussy offensive and to what degree? And you would think that there would be really marked gender differences on this. They're not as marked as you would think. There are, slight differences that particular words are thought to be more offensive. What's really different is the extent of reported use. So women report using words like pussy and bitch and so on. They report, we don't know whether it's true, but they report using them less than men report using them, but they don't necessarily find them they don't report finding them much more offensive. So yes, there are certainly some cases where you would find really important differences. Offense isn't the only thing that we're interested in though, right? I mean, in a free society, what you want to do is you want to find a way for people to have maximal freedom within the limits that are imposed by not causing harm to other people, right? That's why, libel, for example, works the way that it does. You can say anything you want about someone as long as it doesn't cause them demonstrable harm, right? And so the question is, in a free society, how can you tell whether the use of a particular word is causing harm, and if so, to whom? That's tricky, right? And it certainly is going to differ from person to person, but there's some evidence that slurs in particular, not the other words, but slurs in particular have the capacity to cause harm. So for example, when people are exposed to slurs, for example, homophobic slurs, they act in a more discriminatory fashion towards members of that group. So if when you bring people into the lab and you subconsciously, they don't even see these words, they don't know that they see them, you subconsciously prime them with faggot versus homosexual. And then you tell them, okay, so now you're going to go into another room, you're going to have a conversation with a student here at the university named Mark, and he's homosexual, and would you take these two chairs and put them next to each other so that you can have a conversation together? And you measure how far apart people put the chairs. You find that they put them about 10 centimeters farther apart if they've been primed with faggot. And you see other sorts of stuff. If they're primed with faggot, they think that less money should go to AIDS, HIV prevention, all things being equal. So there's a lot of social harm that we know happens just by the use of these words. So if you could make a case that these words are globally harmful, then maybe there's a legal case, not just a moral case, for treating these words as not protected speech.
Well, that's what was behind your stories of the woman who said, quit smashing the fucking bread to her husband, or maybe it was her kid, and she got arrested. Or Kobe being fined for saying whatever, fucking faggot or whatever he said on the court. Yeah, it's an attempt to regulate it with money, with fines or prison time even.
Right.
Under that theory that it causes harm.
Well, in the case of the NBA, I think that it causes harm to their bottom line. I think that they don't.
Oh,
want,
yes.
Yeah, I think the NBA is worried about what the players say because they're worried about hurting the referee's feelings or anything like that. I think that they're mostly concerned about parents hearing it on a television broadcast that's not bleeped, and then the letters come. Right.
Yeah, that's right. Anyone up there? Yeah, Brad?
I remember there a few years back there was a fine for somebody saying fuck on the broadcast radio. And then real close to that there was one YouTube guy made a comment, that was fucking great. And they let that go because it was a descriptive thing instead of using words.
Well, that's tricky, although the FCC is very clear about this. And the Supreme Court has regularly, whenever questioned, has supported the FCC's right to regulate language however they see fit and to define profanity however they see fit. So when Bono they won the what was it, the Golden Globe, I think, for best movie theme song for the Gangs of New York. Was that a movie?
I think so, yeah.
I think that was a movie, and I think that they did the soundtrack. Anyway, so he went up there and said, "Oh, this is fucking brilliant." There was a fine levied, right? Even though this was in 2003, I think. Even though it was just an adjective, it wasn't a verb talking about a sexual activity. Nevertheless, the FCC decided that word, whenever you hear it, is fine-worthy. So I don't know that they're making the nuanced distinctions that maybe linguists would.
Yeah.
Yes.
did you ever look into the difference between, in using profanity and
Yeah, so there's been a little bit of work on this. There are always interesting differences, but they're not always the ones that you would predict. So when you look at this, this stick your hand in cold water task, everyone seems to show a benefit from swearing while they do that. Men report that it hurts less also. They can hold their hand in longer and they say it hurts less. Women can hold their hands in longer, but they don't report that it hurts less. Why? I have no idea. Is it interesting? Potentially. There are differences in the specific words. So if you look at, again, this is work by Tim Jay at University of Massachusetts. If you look at the specific words that people use as their profanity, whether it's boys versus girls, men versus women, across genders, there are differences in the most common words that are used. Again, what that means exactly. So if you count it as a swear, teenage girls say, oh my God, a lot more than teenage boys do. Boys say shit a lot more than teenage girls do. I don't know what that tells us exactly. But yeah, so there are oftentimes stark differences. We know that in general, there's a common cultural belief that women are more conservative with language, that they are less likely to be out at the forefront of the linguistic frontiers of pushing the limits. I don't know that always ends up being true, especially not in the case of social uses of language like profanity. So there are some differences, but I wouldn't say that I have a neat, clean story to tell you. Men do this. If I did, I'd have a great stand-up routine, I guess, but I don't have that.
It's funny you said, "Oh my God," and it doesn't even feel like any kind of cursing.
Yeah, oh my God is not. Yeah.
No, most part because it's not my native language. I cannot curse in my native language at all. So,
that's quite fun. But you can curse in English.
yes.
And you learn a bunch of new ones.
Actually, I feel so happy that I learned it. That need to release your anger or whatever frustration, your emotion.
But that seems to be universal. Whether people do it through profanity is maybe variable.
Well, my wife, I said, is German. Her English is her second language, but she can curse in both languages really well. I've heard it. And it seems to have the same emotional expressiveness.
We'll just hook her up to a lie detector.
Yeah, see if it works, yeah. I would recommend watching a video on YouTube from Tim Minchin, Minchin. He's an Australian singer-songwriter and comedian who does sort of Tom Lear type lyrics, social commentary. Skeptics, atheists love him because he does a lot of pro-science kind of stuff. One of his songs is called Prejudice. So he starts off in this sort of slow blues type on the piano with blue lights and so on, talking about this word that we can't use anymore. And it's got an N and an I and a couple of G's and an E and an R, and it goes on, that only the people that are this can call themselves that, and it just causes so much harm and so on and so on. And then he shifts to the second part of the song, which is only a ginger can call another ginger. And then the whole thing is about gingers. He's a ginger, redhead. And it sort of diffuses, I think, in a way, that word, the other word. But in a way, it's also social commentary that, gingers have not suffered the same kind of abuse that word has this other population, and so it's a sort of a double meaning. It's well worth watching. I was going to try to play it here, but it's about an 8-minute song. It's pretty long, but it's very, very insightful in terms of the power of language and how you can actually laugh about it in the right context. So, well, thank you all for coming, and thank our guest, Benjamin, one more time.
Thank you.
What, sir, is your favorite swear word?
Today, so I've got an Australian friend who calls people cunt waffles. That seems to me, it joins together the impact of the strongest word, one of the strongest words in Australian with waffle.